All right, Buttercup, it's time for that Guardians of the Ancient Tournament Tactician Seasonal Edition. My name is Boulevard, going to be casting this tomorrow with Jay Doza at twitch.tv/GiantSlayerLOR or Legends of Runeterra by Giant Slayer on YouTube. And we're going to just hop right into it. We're going to kind of go deck by deck on this one, do a full overhaul analysis of the meta, kind of like we did last time for the Seasonal Edition, because we got a lot of time on our hands, a lot of things to talk about. Now, Tier 1 more or less has been locked in. We like Thresh, Nasus, Azir Aurelia, TLC, and Dragons are like probably the most popular decks that we're going to be seeing. Last Seasonal, I didn't think Dragons was going to be as popular, and it still showed up en masse, and I think that players are once again just kind of going to default to a deck like this, especially because the newer Zoe Shyvana builds that have cut Aurelion Soul, or so I'm told, have a pretty good matchup against Azir Aurelia. So if you want to beat Azir Aurelia, taking Thresh, Nasus, Dragons, and then some other pile meant to beat Azir Aurelia is something, once again, I'm going to recommend that you not bring a target lineup, that you just bring a pile of your popular and favorite decks. But we're going to kind of get into the strengths and weaknesses of everything. So, Thresh, Nasus. This is a deck that is a little bit hard to target. The things that are really doing pretty well against it right now are obviously the Ruben pile, just being one of, if not the only Hush decks in the meta. Aesol Demacia still does pretty well against it as well with all of the Hushes. And then for the third deck, you can bring TLC. Draven Ezreal, I think, is closer to 50-50 than you want it to be. I've heard that Thralls actually does pretty well against Nasus, and so does Overwhelm. So you've got a couple of options. Nasus is a pretty safe pick overall, though. I don't think players are really going to be looking to pick on this one because it is one of the harder decks to pick on in terms of, like, consistency. Like, yes, TLC will beat it, but it's more of, like, a 60-40. Yes, Frostbite midrange will beat it, but it's also 60-40. Frostbite midrange is not the most consistent deck in the world, and I'll get over why these are highlighted green and red and stuff as we go on. Draven Ezreal is just, like, a really safe pick. It goes into a few counter lineups. It's mostly here because I know that there are players that really enjoy Draven Ezreal and, like, kind of one-trick this, and it sort of fits the same vein as Aesol Demacia, where it's a very safe pick. It's going to do what you need it to do. It slots very well into a power lineup, and I think the safest lineup, one of the safest lineups you can craft, is probably going to have Draven Ezreal and Aesol Demacia in it, and then you kind of go from there. These are the decks that have been performing really well on ladder outside of sort of the big three of TLC, Aurelia, and Nasus. So I think that Draven Ezreal and Aesol Demacia are like your key safe choices. Now, Aesol Demacia is highlighted red because I think that it should not be played as much. Players really come out with this one en masse. I don't think the deck is as good as it should be to get the representation that it deserves, right? It's going to be a very high play rate deck. If you want to exploit a deck, you could try and exploit Aesol Demacia. I think it's going to be pretty popular across the board. Aesol Demacia is not even genuine anymore because a lot of players have gone to the Zoe Shyvana. I'll adjust that later. But I think that Aesol Demacia and Draven Ezreal, like, really going to fit into these safer lineups. Aesol Demacia gonna be really popular, should not be really popular. Draven Ezreal, not gonna be very popular, should be very popular, if that makes sense. You know, sort of the duality of Aesol Demacia and Draven Ezreal kind of fitting into the same slot, both of them in the same lineup. I actually like that a decent amount for an Aesol Demacia deck. Like, if you're gonna put Aesol Demacia with anything, I want you to pair it with Draven Ezreal. I want you to go, like, full safety mode, hodl, and just play the safest lineup you possibly can and hope that your player skill is enough to get you there. And it'll probably work. Almost certainly, like, 3 people minimum are going to top with Draven Ezreal and Aesol Demacia as 2 of the decks in their lineup. Aurelia Azir is exploitable, and it's going to be pretty popular, but once again, over the course of a 9-round event, I don't think anything is going to be popular enough that you can go for a hard counter lineup, and I think that soft countering Azir Aurelia is really ineffective. Like, soft counter Nasus Endor, sure. Soft counter TLC, great. Soft countering Aurelia Azir is pretty ineffective. If you want to beat Aurelia Azir, if you want this to be one of the decks that you leave open, I think you need to hard counter it. Or, you know, you could just, like, have that Draven Ezreal and that Aesol Demacia lineup. That's, like, actually a pretty okay soft counter to Aurelia Azir. Like, if you just go, like, Nasus, Draven Ezreal, Aesol Demacia, I would call that a soft counter lineup to Aurelia Azir. Of course, Aurelia Azir does still have those explosive hands that aggro decks tend to, and can just blow you out of the water. Which is why, you know, I wouldn't necessarily recommend bringing Nasus, Draven, and Aesol Demacia, but if you're looking to pick on Aurelia Azir, I would imagine that the lineups that we see have the most success with that are going to be like Nasus, Ezreal, and Aesol Demacia. But I think this deck's going to be really popular, almost certainly going to be the most popular deck in Top Cut. It'll probably go like Azir, Aurelia, Nasus, and then TLC, even though it shouldn't be TLC, once again, highlighted in red because this deck is going to be more popular than it should be. TLC is the deck that you can, like, go for hard counter lineups and still beat the rest of the field. There's just a lot of things that beat TLC right now. Azir Aurelia absolutely dumpsters it. Frostbite midrange and Overwhelm, 2 decks with pretty good matchups into it. You know, Deep is another deck that I think is doing really well. Players have started to kind of figure out how to make this beat both Nasus and Aesol Demacia. So if you can get your Deep deck to beat these other mid-range piles and then go in and still obviously have a very good TLC matchup, then I think Deep's going to be a really good deck on the weekend. I don't think it's going to be as popular as it was in the Empires of the Ascended seasonal, though. I think that TLC is going to be hard countered in other ways, or even just soft countered. But the high presence of Aurelia Azir is something alone that should probably stifle you off of TLC. It's so hard to say for sure. I think the TLC is still going to put up a decent top cut representation. I would be surprised if it's over half. And I really don't think it should be half. It certainly won't be the 22 that it put up in the America Shard last seasonal. And then Frostbite midrange highlighted in green. I think this is a deck that's not going to get played enough. That should get played more. It does well into TLC. It does well into Nasus. It does well into Aesol Demacia. And there's really not a lot of aggro in the format outside of Azir Aurelia. If you're running Frostbite midrange, you will get bodied by anybody who like brings Azir Aurelia and discard aggro. And I think it's not uncommon to see like discard overwhelm Aurelia Azir. I ran stats a couple of weeks ago, and the decks that we were seeing paired most often with Aurelia Azir, it was like a three-way tie. It was like Deep, Overwhelm, Draven Ezreal, discard aggro, I believe. And obviously, like, Deep is there as a TLC counter, Overwhelm arguably also a TLC counter, and then the Draven Ezreal and discard were there, presumably as, I guess, like, Nasus counters. I know that, like, discard has pretty polarized matchups. I don't know what they are off the top of my head, but I don't think you're going to be running into too many of those more aggressive lineups because they don't do well into the Aesol Demacia and the Draven Ezreal. And you have to understand that like Aesol Demacia and Draven Ezreal are two decks that have been so popular on the America's ladder that they should translate pretty well into seasonal popularity. For like as different as the meta is between ladder and tournament, the ladder still makes its way into tournaments in the bigger events like this because most of the players, you know, just take their ladder decks and run it in and say, hey, this is the testing that I did. I got top 10 on ladder. That's testing for me. You know, I played 3 decks to do it, and I ran into everything that you would expect to see at the seasonal and had a pretty fair shot at it. So I wouldn't expect the Azir Aurelia Overwhelm discard lineups to do particularly well. I think they are just going to kind of run into the problem of like Aesol Demacia, Draven Ezreal, and just these other things that sort of accidentally beat Aurelia Azir. And even if you're not, you know, accidentally beating Aurelia Azir, there could just be people that are going for super safe lineups. Like if you go like TLC, Aesol Demacia, Nasus, I think you're going to have a pretty good shot at beating, you know, like if you can line up the TLC into the discard and line up the Nasus into the Azir Aurelia, then you should end up winning that matchup. It's kind of a matter of how things play out for you then, matchups-wise, which always sucks, but we're going to move on from there. Then we're on to Deep. Deep's going to put up a little bit of a top cut representation. I expect it to be wildly underplayed in the seasonal comparative to where it was last season. But the players that are playing it are going to be a lot better at it this time around. I think they understood that, hey, I probably should have run this in Empires of Ascended. It had a really good run in that seasonal. Probably have a really good run in this seasonal as well. It does absolutely terrible into Aurelia Azir, but it beats TLC really hard, and apparently players have found a way to start to swap it around on Nasus and Door. So Deep is one of the things that I'm definitely on the lookout for. The Rubin Pile really only coming out as like a Nasus Indoor sort of counter. I think the Rubin Pile is actually going to do pretty poorly this seasonal. It's never done great into dragons. It doesn't have, you know, sort of the removal tools that you need to be able to keep up with dragons on board. It doesn't really have anything to stop the TLC combo from coming out, and it's also not killing TLC fast enough. Against Aurelia Azir, it's like, it's not good. You know, it's winnable for the Rubin Pile, but it's not great, and ultimately I think that the deck is just a little bit too volatile into what we expect to be seeing in order to perform admirably. You know, it did win the last seasonal, though, and I kind of downplayed it there as well, so it's one of those things where, like, if you're well-versed on the Rubin Pile, by all means, run the Rubin Pile. If you want to run double Targon, the Rubin Pile is probably in your lineup, and if you've, you know, got some kind of cool tech in there that's going to make it beat all these other decks, I think it's fine, but ultimately, I'm not in love with, like, how Deep and the Rubin Pile are going to do in Swiss rounds. I think these are going to be top-cut houses, but as far as the actual Swiss rounds of the portion, like, I don't think you're going to have as much success as you would like running these decks, but hey, at the end of the day, it does come out into what matchups you actually run into. Frostbite Foundry, among a similar vein, does very well into Nasus Indoor. It's not going to beat Aurelia Azir. And really, it's just coming down to like, hey, do you want to run this triple Frostbite lineup that we've seen have some success in the past? You know, if you want to go TLC, Frostbite Midrange, and Frostbite Foundry, yeah, you're probably going to beat every Nasus player that you run into. You're not going to do anything against Aurelia Azir, but hey, if you know, run into like Nasus, Aurelia, and I don't know, let's say Frostbite Midrange, you'll probably beat that with the triple Freljord lineup. You know, you just ban the Aurelia Azir, you beat up on Nasus Endor. You really just kind of look to beat up on any mid-range deck with this lineup, and I don't hate that because I am expecting a high presence of Aesol Demacia and Nasus Endor. So yeah, I actually really like the way that the triple Freljord lineup is poised for Swiss, which I didn't love last time. So definitely something to be on the lookout for. Aesol Demacia, I feel like I've talked about it at this point. Lee Sin, once again, down and out, but if you told me it wins the seasonal, I wouldn't be surprised. Discard aggro, we went over a little bit. It's really into like these anti-Nasus lineups, these anti-Aurelia Azir lineups. It's possible to go faster than Aurelia Azir, but you know, discard aggro is so swingy and dependent on the kind of hand that you draw, that I think that playing aggro is just not something that you want to be doing to try and beat out the Aurelia Azir. I actually went in depth a little bit earlier this month about the success rate of triple aggro in previous seasonals, and I'll link the article down below that I wrote for Giant Slayer about that, because I think it is interesting. Historically, triple aggro has performed very poorly. Only 2 players in the last 3 seasonals have been able to run triple aggro and make it out of groups. You know, out of the Swiss rounds into the top cut. And that starts with a Azir Aurelia, and that starts with discard aggro. And where you want to go from there is up to you, but I think these are the 2 aggro decks that, like, you're gonna have to have in your lineup if you want to play the triple aggro game. Because 12 1-drop aggro is dead. Pirate aggro, Spiders, these are not decks that are performing well. They've historically never done great at the seasonal. They're always the boogeyman for the Americas, like, oh no, they're gonna come out of nowhere, and they're gonna absolutely blow me out of the water. And it just doesn't happen. So, you know, running 2 aggro decks is fine, running 1 aggro deck is fine, but going all in on that triple aggro, not so good. And like, if you go discard Overwhelm and Aurelia Azir, I definitely consider Overwhelm more of a mid-range deck, just in the way that it plays. I don't think anyone's going to argue on that one too much. At least the Shurima Freljord version. The Noxus versions in the past were much more aggressive. But, you know, I think that discard Aurelia Azir and Overwhelm is probably going to be the most played discard lineup. So if this is something that you're worried about, then understand that, like, these are probably the decks that are going to be paired with it most often, and maybe you can look to tweak your decks a little bit more for the Overwhelm matchup or something along those lines if you're running 3 things to get hosed by discard. Thralls is sort of a late entry into this. The Masters data that Legends of Runeterra's Twitter posted a couple days ago actually cited Thralls as having the same play rate as, you know, just normal Lissandra, which is honestly kind of insane that we're at that point. And I think that Thralls is going to be like, this is Thrall's time to shine. I don't think it's going to be able to match TLC in terms of presence in the top cut or even in popularity within the tournament, but Thralls does very well into TLC. If you wanted to hard counter TLC, you're looking at Aurelia Azir, Deep, and Thralls 10,000%. That is your hard counter TLC lineup. And honestly, if if the world is to be believed, and hey, yeah, we've made Deep able to beat Nasus. I've heard that Thralls does very well into Nasus as well if you can survive some of the more aggressive hands, although that's kind of the discussion, right, is how well can you handle those aggressive hands. You need the board wipe to line up at the proper time. You're probably not beating, like, Bakai Reaper into Cursed Keeper into Ravenous Butcher. But if none of your lineup is beating that anyway, then hey, yeah, by all means, go for it. Go hog wild. Play the Thralls into the Nasus. But Thralls does, you know, it doesn't beat Aurelia Azir, but I think that it actually does do very well against the other mid-range decks. Aesol Demacia, it's going to do a lot better against than Draven Ezreal. I think Draven Ezreal is sort of like the other mid-range Slayer that is going to come out of left field, and, you know, it's got the Scorched Earth and to be able to take out the Thralls landmarks, so when you go for that promising future, trying to double up on your Thrall, it's not really going to work out. But I do think that, like, an anti-mid-range lineup of Draven Ezreal, Aesol Demacia, and Thralls, or like Draven Ezreal, Frostbite, mid-range, and Thralls, it might actually be one of the ways to go. It's going to do very well into, you know, Aesol Demacia and TLC. Maybe not the Draven Ezreal as much, but you get what I'm saying. Like, you have a spread of matchups, and if you're really just expecting people to, like, bring, like, the Rubin pile and Aesol Demacia and, you know, Overwhelm, you know, maybe this is the lineup that goes for it, because Thralls is a lot faster than I think people are giving it credit for. I'm not sure how its Overwhelm matchup is, but I think that, like, Thralls, Aurelia, or, sorry, yeah, Thralls, Aesol Demacia, and Draven Ezreal is, like, a pretty decent lineup. Maybe take out the Aesol Demacia for Frostbite mid-range. You're a little bit weaker to aggro at that point, but your Thralls were already weak to aggro, so you might as well all in on that strategy, right? Get some shared weaknesses in there, because if one of your decks is going to get 2-0'd, it doesn't really matter if 2 of your decks get 2-0'd by their lineup, and like I said, we're really not seeing a high success rate for triple aggro, though that doesn't mean there won't be a high play rate for triple aggro. Getting into the Overwhelm deck, this is, like, it's highlighted green because I think this is going to be one of the best performing tier 2 decks, which, you know, not exactly a fair fight since I put Aesol Demacia in there, and that'll almost certainly be the best performing one, but I think that Overwhelm is something that a lot of players have really started to pick up on in the later stages. It rounds out a lot of lineups very well. Its popularity is probably going to be medium. I don't think it's going to be a low success rate deck. I think it's probably going to put 5 or 6 of them in the top cut. I think that Overwhelm's popularity is going to be like comparable to Draven Ezreal, where I feel like more players should be playing it, and they're just not. The deck is a little bit static, can lose to itself a little bit. I don't think it did anything, you know, out of the ordinary in the Empires of the Ascended seasonal. It kind of did what you expected it to. I think it put like 3 people in top cut. But I would expect Overwhelm to do a little bit better this time around. The addition of Merciless Hunter not only did wonders for Nasus, but Overwhelm as well, just sort of being that second Shurima mid-range style deck that gets to really take advantage of a card like this, and of course loving the vulnerable with the Renekton in the deck. I think that Overwhelm is super well positioned if you want to take out TLC. I think it does okay into Aesol Demacia. You really got to get your buffs down onto the Ruin Runner and hope that the Hush doesn't go through, but for the most part, you know, Overwhelm is a solid deck. I would definitely run a couple copies of Three Sisters in here. Make sure that you got those flash freezes on lock for the Aesol Demacia players that shouldn't be there but are, as well as help with your Nasus matchup a little bit. But I think Overwhelm is going to do a lot. It's competing with Thralls for the Shurima Freljord spot, and it's not too often that we actually have 2 decks that are competing with each other based on overlapping regional combination. So you can't get both of these. You really need to think about, as your last deck slot, when you're looking, what Freljord Shurima deck do I want to play? It's like, am I looking to beat mid-range? Am I looking to beat some of the slower things? You know, really, what am I trying to do here? They're both going to beat TLC. Don't even worry about that one. I would say that Overwhelm probably does a little bit better into Nasus. It probably does a little bit better into aggro in general. And then Thralls probably does a little bit better into mid-range and control. So that's really what you're looking for, is like, am I looking to beat, you know, aggro, or am I looking to beat mid-range and control? I think Thralls, for that reason, should be a little bit more popular, but I think that players are still a little too untested on it. I don't know. I'm really pulling for Thralls this weekend to overtake Overwhelm, and maybe because they are competing for the regional slot, you know, one of them's not going to be as popular as I expected to be, but, you know, that is what it is. So getting into Tier 3, we've got the Burblefish Mind Meld, better known as TF Fizz. This deck is still pretty good. Previously, it did really well into Nasus, but with the release of Merciless Hunter, I think that swings back in Nasus's favor. Same thing with Overwhelm. Like, the release of Merciless Hunter really hurt TF Fizz's chances as a counter deck, and it's just not doing what it really needed to do. Spiders, Pirate Aggro, and Noxus Azir really fall into that, like, triple aggro sort of pitfall that I was talking about earlier, where if you're running any of these, you're probably running triple aggro. Like, Spiders and Pirates are really not something that you traditionally throw into a non-triple aggro lineup. Of course, Black Boss did top the Cosmic Creation Seasonal with, like, TF Fizz, an Aphelios deck, and then, like, Pirate aggro is the third deck. So there is some merit to just saying, like, hey, here's my third deck. It's an aggro deck. Is this something that beats you? But for the most part, I think that third aggro deck, if we see one, is going to be Aurelia Azir. If you're running, like, 2 non-aggro and 1 aggro, that aggro is going to be Aurelia Azir. It's not really the time to get cute with, like, Spiders and Pirates and Noxus Azir. I just don't think it's going to do that well. Starspring is kind of weird. It's once again another victim of the printing of Merciless Hunter, not only because, like, obviously Bakai Sandspinner was in the deck before, and you were already giving things vulnerable, but coming down just a little bit earlier, and most importantly having Fearsome, especially as the Nasus lists switch back to much more aggressive posturing, I think Starspring's in a pretty rough spot, but as always, we're going to get 1 Starspring in the top cut. Don't even worry about that. But Starspring's another deck where, like, if you're planning on running Starspring, you're planning on running it. Nothing I can say will sway you to run it or not run it. Shen Demacia, I don't love this deck. I think that it's a much weaker version of, like, Frostbite midrange. As much as I don't like Aesol Demacia right now, I think that it is better than Shen Demacia. Macon Jackson had a little bit of success with this a little bit earlier in the month, picking up a win at the Online League Series with Shen Demacia, but Macon Jackson's just built different when it comes to mid-range decks. I wouldn't try to replicate that success, but I do think that there are other decks that are just better than it that you can substitute in its place. Nightfall, once again, not expecting too much aggro, so I wouldn't really expect Nightfall to perform well. Scargrounds, pretty much completely off the table. There are so many better options for soft and even hard countering TLC and Nasus at this point that I would be incredibly surprised to, like, even see Scargrounds make it on stream at all tomorrow, because it's still at a toppable record by, like, round 5 or 6. That would surprise me to the moon and back. And then, of course, Noxus Azir kind of rounding things out. Once again, it's just like a deck that I feel like you throw in a triple aggro lineup, which we should not be seeing too much of. So, what would I run? Well, I actually really like Draven Ezreal, Thralls, and Frostbite midrange as this, like, sort of anti-midrange lineup. I don't know if that's, like, the best way to go. I think that the best lineup, the one that we are going to see top the most often, is probably going to be, like, as dumb as it sounds, it's probably going to be like Nasus, TLC, and Dragons again, which doesn't feel right. It didn't really feel right last time either. TLC and Nasus probably aren't actually going to end up in the same lineup as much this time around. I think that players have sort of correctly identified that they share too many weaknesses for not having the power. They also share they share common weaknesses, and they really don't share that many strengths. Like, there's not a lot of decks running around right now that lose to both TLC and Nasus. So I think that those decks are actually going to be pretty separated for the most part. I think that we're really filling in the gaps with some of these more Freljord decks, like, you know, Overwhelm or Thralls or Frostbite or even Draven Ezreal. There's so many things that are going to slip into the cracks. I think that, you know, Nasus, Draven Ezreal, Dragons is probably my pick for, like, most popular lineup because, one, those are some of the most popular decks on ladder. Maybe you throw a Azir Aurelia in there somewhere, but I feel like running Nasus, Draven Ezreal, and Aesol Demacia is a little bit more of a cohesive strategy. You know, otherwise, it's just because of, like, what we're seeing Aurelia Azir paired with. You know, you don't want to have so many different weaknesses throughout your lineup that you just lose to everything because they'll 2-0 one of your decks, and I think that might be a problem that Aurelia Azir runs into alongside your Nasus and your Aesol Demacia. Because if we're going strictly off ladder popularity, I'm pretty sure it's, you know, Nasus for sure, Aurelia Azir for sure, and then you pick either Draven Ezreal or Aesol Demacia as your third deck, and that would be the most popular lineup based on ladder performance. But I do think it'll actually end up being Nasus, Draven, Aesol Demacia. So it's kind of my pick for most popular lineup. But yeah, that is gonna do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, we'll be casting the Swiss rounds of Guardians of the Ancient Seasonal tomorrow with JDoza, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We are getting started with round 3. The tournament starts a little bit earlier than that, just because, you know, we're grabbing streams, so grabbing round 1 and 2 might not be the most exciting thing in the world, because it's probably going to be, you know, the streamers, the players that are high up on ladder, the tournament grinders, and then, like, they play against a gauntlet player who's just outclassed. The reality of the situation. It's not going to be a fun watch. So we're jumping in at round 3, going all the way to round 9. Super excited to bring you that at twitch.tv/GiantSlayerLOR. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it a little helpful. And please do not overthink your lineup. Whatever you tested a week ago, somebody is going to top with that. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and good luck tomorrow.